I never considered myself the type of guy who'd be paranoid or overthink things. I was pretty laid back, the kind of person who trusted those closest to me. And I had every reason to, right? I mean, we were doing great. Me and Sophie. Married for 5 years. No kids yet, but we'd been talking about it. We were both in our early 30s, just trying to enjoy life and work our way up the ladder in our careers. We worked together, actually. Sophie and I were colleagues at a tech startup. Her position was pretty high up, managing client accounts and handling big presentations. I was more in the background, data analyst, supporting her with numbers and logistics. We'd meet for lunch during the workday, sometimes grab a drink after work, and we'd both go home together. It was normal. And Sophie? She was always so driven, so ambitious. It was one of the things that attracted me to her. She had this intensity in her work ethic that I admired. But I noticed she'd started staying later and later at the office. The deadlines were getting tighter, the projects more demanding. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I mean, she loved what she did, and I respected that. It wasn't uncommon for her to be the last person to leave the office. I'd be in and out of my own work, but Sophie, well, she was the kind of person who would put in extra hours if it meant getting the job done perfectly. There was a period where I barely saw her during the week, but when we did connect, it was still the same. Warm smiles, brief but meaningful conversations, and an occasional date night. I told myself it was just a phase. The project pressure, the deadlines, I wasn't worried. But then something happened that would completely shatter my world. One evening, I was scrolling through social media, just mindlessly looking through photos. And there it was, a picture of Sophie laughing, sitting at a table in a restaurant. I didn't recognize the location at first. The lighting was warm. The place looked fancy, almost too upscale for a typical dinner outing. But what hit me like a punch in the gut was the man sitting across from her. It was my boss, Marcus. I felt this immediate chill run down my spine. Marcus was someone I'd always respected. Hell, he was the one who'd hired me. But seeing him with Sophie, in such a relaxed and intimate setting, felt off. I'd never seen them together outside of work. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a coincidence? Maybe they were discussing a project or he was just being a mentor. But then, I noticed the way she was looking at him in the photo. It wasn't the casual, professional interaction I was used to seeing between them at work. This was different, much more personal. The way she was leaning in, the way she was smiling, it made me feel unsettled. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew something didn't sit right. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything at work. Every time I saw her, I found myself watching her more closely, looking for something, anything, that would explain what I'd seen. But nothing seemed different on the surface. Sophie was still my wife, still the same woman I'd married. Still my partner, still my Sophie, or so I thought. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. After all, I'd always been the type to give Sophie space, to trust her. We were a team and our marriage was strong, or at least I thought it was. But that photo haunted me. Every time I saw Sophie, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd glance at her, and my mind would race. What were they talking about? Why did they look so comfortable together? But what could I do? Confront her about a photo I'd seen on social media? Felt ridiculous. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband who starts accusing his wife based on a single picture. I told myself it was probably nothing, just two colleagues having dinner. There was no reason to think it was anything more. Yet the more I tried to ignore it, the more the nagging feeling grew. A few days later, I was still struggling with this knot in my stomach when I came across something else. Another photo. This time it was an Instagram story. It was a brief clip of a dinner party, the camera panning across a table full of people. But I immediately recognized Sophie, laughing with Marcus, her head thrown back as she talked. The thing that struck me was how natural they looked together. They weren't talking about work. They weren't just exchanging pleasantries. They were laughing at something personal. They had a connection that I hadn't noticed before. I showed it to a friend at work, someone I trusted. "What do you think?" I asked, trying to play it cool. He looked at the screen for a second, his brow furrowing. Well, they look pretty close, don't they? Yeah, I said, my voice tight. I mean, they're just co-workers, right?
Yeah, man.
Just co-workers, he said, though he didn't sound as convinced as I wanted him to. I didn't want to believe it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Something was off. I could feel it. And the more I looked at Sophie, the more I realized how distant she seemed. Not in a dramatic way, but in these subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior. She'd come home late from work again, but this time when I asked about her day, she seemed distracted, almost rehearsed in her response. Just a long meeting, she'd say, her voice not quite matching the words. The detail was always vague, never anything specific. I couldn't remember the last time she'd told me a real story about work. Everything felt superficial. I decided to dig a little deeper. I wasn't proud of it, but I started checking her phone. Not because I didn't trust her, but because my gut was telling me something wasn't right. And my gut had never lied to me before. Her messages were mostly harmless, nothing suspicious in the first few screens. Work texts, the occasional funny meme. But then I came across a conversation that made my blood run cold. It was a text from Marcus. Just 2 words. Miss you. That was it. Nothing else. But it was enough. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. The air in the room grew heavy, and the ground beneath me felt unstable, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. My fingers trembled as I scrolled up, searching for more. And sure enough, the conversations between them had grown more personal over the past few weeks. Discussions about plans after work, joking around about getting together for a drink or two. But what really stuck out to me were the moments that felt like inside jokes. Those little exchanges that you only have with someone you've known for a long time. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a friendly relationship. It was something deeper, something more intimate. But I still didn't have concrete proof. I couldn't accuse her of anything without knowing for sure. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I needed answers. The day after I saw Sophie's texts with Marcus, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I tried to push it all down, to tell myself I was being irrational. But the doubt kept creeping in. My mind replayed that photo of them at dinner, how she was looking at him like he was more than just a colleague. Felt wrong, all of it. When Sophie sent me a message later that afternoon saying she'd be working late again, I decided it was time to do something I never thought I'd do. I was going to find out the truth. I told myself it was just to clear my head. I'd drive to her office, see if everything seemed normal. Nothing suspicious. I needed to see it for myself to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I parked a block away from her office building, my hands sweaty on the steering wheel. From where I sat, I could see the glass doors to the lobby. Sophie's car was parked in the lot, as expected. She wasn't leaving yet. For a long time, I just sat there, watching the entrance, telling myself I was being crazy. But then I saw her. Sophie stepped out of the building, her phone in hand, texting or scrolling. She didn't notice me watching. I saw her get into her car, and that's when I saw him. Marcus, my boss. They weren't just having a casual conversation. Marcus stepped toward her, a hand brushing against her arm. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My stomach twisted. The way they looked at each other. There was something more there. Something I hadn't seen before. Something I didn't want to see. They walked across the street toward a restaurant complex. I followed. I parked farther down the road, hoping to stay out of sight, and walked back toward the restaurant. My heart was hammering in my chest. What was I hoping to find? What was I even looking for? Through the window, I saw them sitting at a table. Sophie was leaning in, her hand resting on the table. Marcus was smiling at her like she was the most important person in the room. And that's when it hit me. I was the outsider now. They had their own world, their own bond. I could feel the truth creeping up behind me, suffocating me. Sophie wasn't just working late anymore. She was with him, and I had been blind to it for months. I didn't go inside. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened Instagram, and searched for the restaurant tag. A new post appeared. Sophie and Marcus, smiling, arms around each other. My vision blurred as the reality set in. The photo wasn't just casual. It was intimate. They weren't just colleagues or friends. They were together. That text from Marcus, the one I'd seen on Sophie's phone earlier, "Miss you," suddenly had a weight I couldn't ignore. This wasn't an affair anymore. It was something deeper, something real. I stood there, staring at the photo on my phone, the truth crashing over me. I wasn't just losing my wife. I was losing everything I thought I knew about our life. And at that moment, I realized I had no idea who Sophie was anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of Sophie and Marcus haunted me. The way they looked at each other, the way they seemed to share a secret I wasn't part of. My mind raced, but one thing was clear. I had to confront her. I couldn't keep living in this cloud of doubt. The next evening, Sophie came home late again, just like always. She smiled, kissed me, and everything felt normal. But it wasn't. Couldn't be. I had seen too much, felt too much. We had dinner in near silence, both of us avoiding the unspoken. But I couldn't take it anymore. As she cleared her plate, I spoke up. "Sophie, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaky. She looked up, her eyes soft, but I could see the flicker of something. Maybe guilt, maybe fear. "Sure, babe. What's up?" she asked, wiping her hands on a napkin. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. My heart was pounding in my chest. "I saw a photo of you and Marcus at a restaurant, together. You looked close," I said, trying to keep my tone even, though I was shaking inside. Sophie froze. Her face went blank for a second. Then she quickly recovered. "What? That's ridiculous. We were just discussing work," she said quickly, brushing off the comment. But I couldn't let it go. "It didn't look like work, Sophie. You were laughing, leaning in like you were more than just colleagues." She stiffened, the mask slipping for a moment. "You're imagining things, John. It was a casual dinner," she said, her voice defensive. But there was something off in her tone. Something strained. "Was it?" I pressed. "Because it didn't look like just work to me. It looked personal." Sophie's eyes shifted, avoiding mine. She stood up abruptly. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice growing cold.
I'm tired.
"I'm going to bed." Without waiting for a response, she walked out of the room. I stood there, staring at the empty space she'd left behind, feeling like I'd just been hit with a ton of bricks. She was lying. I could feel it. But why was she lying? What was she hiding? I wanted to run after her, demand the truth, but I stayed frozen in place, my mind swirling with anger and confusion. How could I have been so blind? I had seen the warning signs for weeks, but I refused to believe them. I had trusted her. I felt like I was losing everything, and yet Sophie still didn't see what was happening. She thought she could keep pretending, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Should I press her further? Should I just wait for her to come clean? Or was I already too late to fix anything? The next few days were a blur. Sophie continued her usual routine: work, late nights, minimal conversation when she came home. But something was different now. The silence between us was heavy, like a wall I couldn't break through. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The confrontation hadn't gone as I'd hoped. Sophie hadn't admitted anything. She'd shut me down, as if nothing was wrong. But I knew better now. The truth was right in front of me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed more evidence. I needed proof. One night, after Sophie left for another late shift, I made a decision. I'd go through her things. I hated the idea of it, but I couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. I had to know. I started with her purse. It was a quick search, just a glance through her wallet, phone, and keys. Nothing. No messages, no receipts. Nothing that would tie her to Marcus. But then, my eyes landed on something odd. A hotel keycard. It wasn't one I recognized. The name on the card didn't mean anything to me, but the logo on the back made my stomach turn. It was from a hotel I knew well, a luxury spot downtown. A place people went for privacy. My heart sank. I had to know when she'd been there. I pulled out my phone and Googled the hotel. searching for reviews and photos. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but my gut told me there was something I needed to see. And that's when I found it. The hotel's social media page showed a photo from a couple of weeks ago. A picture of a couple standing at the check-in desk, laughing. I didn't need to zoom in to recognize the faces. It was Sophie and Marcus. I felt the ground shift beneath me. I was no longer in doubt. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was real. They'd been sneaking around behind my back, staying in this hotel, probably more than once. And I had no idea. I stood there, staring at the photo on my phone, my fingers numb. For a long time I couldn't breathe. This was it. I had the evidence I needed. But the thought of confronting her again felt unbearable. What would I even say? Couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend anymore. But I didn't know if I was ready to hear her answer. The truth was undeniable now. Sophie was having an affair with Marcus, and I had been living in a lie for months. I had to face her. I had to ask her about it, even though I already knew the answer. But deep down, I also knew that nothing would ever be the same again. No matter what happened next, my world had already been shattered. I spent the entire night pacing, my mind racing with thoughts of Sophie and Marcus. The keycard, the hotel photo, everything I'd found, it all pointed in one direction. But I was still stuck in that moment, unable to take the next step. Confronting her felt like walking into a storm with no shelter. I couldn't stop thinking about the image of her and Marcus at the hotel. The way they looked so carefree, so happy. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie had been lying to me for months, hiding something that was slowly destroying everything we built. By morning, I couldn't wait any longer. I had to know the truth, even if it shattered me. Sophie came downstairs, looking tired but still smiling as she grabbed her coffee. I watched her, feeling the weight of what was coming. My pulse quickened. "Morning," she said casually, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Morning," I replied, my voice tight. I couldn't keep it in any longer. I had to ask. "Sophie, I know what's going on. I know about the hotel, the photos, about you and Marcus." Her hand froze mid-sip, the mug hovering near her lips. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. Then she put the mug down slowly, her face suddenly hardening. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice calm, but I could hear the underlying tension. "I saw the photo. The one from the hotel," I said, watching her closely. "And the keycard. Don't lie to me, Sophie. I know the truth." She didn't look at me for a moment, her eyes fixed on the table. Then, in a low voice, she spoke. "I wasn't lying to you. I wasn't trying to hurt you." Her words came out in a rush, like she was struggling to find the right ones. "Marcus and I were not just colleagues. It's more than that. Okay?" I felt my chest tighten. "So it's true? You've been seeing him behind my back?" Sophie looked up at me then, her eyes soft with something like regret, but also defiance. "Yes," she admitted. "But it wasn't about you. I didn't want to hurt you, John. I didn't know how to stop it." I could hardly breathe. The words stung like a slap, each one deeper than the last. She didn't want to hurt me? That was her excuse? How could she think that lying and sneaking around for months didn't hurt me? I stood up, anger rising in me like a storm. "So you were having an affair with Marcus? You've been lying to me this whole time. About the hotel, the dinners, everything." Her face flushed. "I didn't want to lose you, John. I didn't know what to do. Started so small, just work stuff, but then couldn't stop it. I thought I could keep it separate, but I couldn't. I didn't want to hurt you." She broke off, her voice wavering. I could barely process what she was saying. I had spent years trusting her, and she had been living in a world where I didn't exist. Not in the way I thought. "Are you in love with him?" I asked, the words falling out of me before I could stop them. My throat was tight, my voice raw. Sophie hesitated, the silence hanging thick in the air between us. She glanced down at her hands, fidgeting nervously. I don't know. Maybe. I'm so confused, John. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't want to hurt you. My mind was spinning. I didn't know how to feel. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. All of it crashed over me like waves. "I think you need to leave," I said, my voice shaking now. I couldn't look at her anymore. "I need some time to think. I need space." Sophie stood up, her face crumpling with regret, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, gathering her things in silence. As she walked out the door, I stood there, motionless, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. My entire life had just been torn apart in a single conversation. And as much as I wanted to scream, to run after her, I stayed frozen. Because deep down, I knew I had just lost her. And maybe, just maybe, I had lost myself too. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to run after her, beg her to stay, promise I'd forgive her. But I couldn't. Not when the truth had been laid bare in front of me. She had betrayed me, and Marcus, my boss, had been right there beside her, helping to destroy everything I thought I knew. I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the empty space where she had been only moments before. My mind raced through the memories. The late nights at work, the sudden distance between us, the unexplained absences. How had I been so blind? So stupid? The signs were always there, but I ignored them. Because I wanted to believe. Because I didn't want to face the truth. I reached for my phone almost instinctively. I wanted to call someone. Anyone. But who could I turn to? My friends? They'd always liked Sophie. Always said we made the perfect couple. What would they think now? Could I even talk to them without breaking down? I put the phone down, the weight of the decision too heavy to carry. The next few days were a blur. Sophie didn't come back. She didn't call or text. It was as if she'd disappeared completely. At first, I thought maybe I'd hear from her soon. Maybe she'd want to talk, to explain herself more, to try and fix things. But the silence stretched on. I started to feel like I was drowning in it, suffocating with no air to breathe. I tried to focus on work, on anything that could distract me. But Marcus, my boss, kept popping into my mind. Every time I walked into the office, I saw his face. I thought of all the hours we'd spent together, all the times he'd smiled at me, asked how I was doing, pretending like everything was fine. He knew. He had to have known. The anger bubbled up inside me again. How could he do this? How could he betray me, use his position to manipulate me, to destroy my marriage? Was this some sort of sick game to him? I wanted to confront him. I wanted to walk into his office, slam the door behind me, and demand answers. But I was terrified. What would happen if I did? Would he lie? Would he deny everything? Act like he hadn't done anything wrong? Would he rub it in my face that he had what I couldn't keep? And then there was Sophie. I wanted to hate her, to feel nothing but anger and betrayal. But part of me still missed her. I missed the way we used to laugh, the way she'd hold my hand during quiet moments. It hurt to think that the woman I had loved, the woman I thought I knew, could betray me so completely. I tried to focus on the things I could control. I worked long hours, stayed late in the office, avoided going home. But nothing could fill the void she had left behind. Then, one afternoon, I received a text from Sophie.
I'm sorry.
I know I hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need to tell you something. Please meet me at the park tonight. I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. Was she coming back? Was she going to beg for forgiveness? Or was this just another attempt to explain herself, to make herself feel better? I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to meet her, to hear her out. But another part of me was terrified of what she would say. But the truth was, I didn't have a choice. I couldn't move on without hearing her side, without understanding what had driven her to destroy everything. I sat there for a long time, thinking about what to do. Eventually, I texted back, "I'll be there." And as I sent the message, I realized something. I wasn't just going to meet Sophie tonight. I was going to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The park was quiet when I arrived, the sun sinking low on the horizon. Sophie was sitting on a bench near the fountain, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed. She looked small, like the weight of the world had finally crushed her. I stopped a few feet away, unsure if I wanted to sit down or turn and walk away. But I couldn't leave, not without hearing the truth. I approached slowly, and she glanced up, her eyes red and swollen. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice shaking. I didn't respond. I sat at the edge of the bench, leaving a gap between us. The silence was unbearable, stretching on as I waited for her to speak. Finally, I broke it. "What do you want to say, Sophie?" My voice was low but steady, though my hands trembled in my lap. She took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously. "I owe you the truth," she began, staring at the ground. "I've been lying to you, John, for months." I stayed quiet, letting her continue. Every word felt like it carried a knife, poised to cut deeper. "It started with work," she said. "The late nights, the dinners. At first, it really was just about projects. But then, things changed. Marcus and I started talking more about life, about things outside of work. I didn't realize it at first, but we were getting too close." She paused, glancing at me, her eyes pleading. I just stared, waiting. "By the time I knew it was wrong, I couldn't stop it," she said, her voice breaking. "It wasn't planned. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And it went further than it ever should have." I felt my chest tighten, the reality crashing down on me. "So you're telling me you've been having an affair? With Marcus, my boss?" My voice rose slightly, anger breaking through the numbness. "Yes," she admitted, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, John. I never wanted to hurt you." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. "You didn't want to hurt me?" I repeated bitterly. "You lied to me for months. You snuck around. You chose to hurt me." Sophie flinched, tears streaming down her face now. "I didn't choose this," she said, her voice desperate. "I didn't want it to happen, but it did. And are you in love with him?" I interrupted, my voice sharp. I needed to know. She hesitated, and the pause was all the answer I needed. I don't know," she said finally. "I think I might be, but I still love you, John."
I swear I do.
Her words felt like a punch to the gut. I stood abruptly, unable to sit there any longer. "You don't love me, Sophie. Not really. If you did, this wouldn't have happened." "Please," she said, standing too, reaching out toward me. "Don't leave like this. Let me explain." "There's nothing else to explain," I said coldly. "You made your choice." I turned and walked away, her voice calling after me. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. Behind me, the truth lingered, like a wound that would never heal. The text from Marcus came just after I'd finally convinced myself to let it all go. "We need to talk." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. My fingers hovered over the screen, my mind racing. I already knew what this was about. Sophie must have told him I knew. Now he was going to make his move. Couldn't ignore it. I needed answers. So I typed back, "Where?" A moment later, the reply came. "My office. 8 p.m. Don't bring anyone." I hesitated but knew I couldn't back out. I had to face him. I had to hear him say it. Hear him admit everything. I arrived at the office just before 8 p.m. The building was nearly empty, a few lights flickering above. I knocked on Marcus's door, my heart thumping. "Come in." His voice was calm. I opened the door. He was sitting behind his desk, looking relaxed, as if nothing was wrong. I closed the door softly behind me, trying to steady my breath. "Thanks for coming, John," he said, his tone casual. "Take a seat." I didn't sit. "Cut the small talk, Marcus. I know everything." He didn't react, just looked at me, waiting. "You've been sleeping with my wife," I said, my voice strained. "How long has this been going on?" "Months," he said with a shrug, like it didn't matter. "But I never intended for it to go this far. It just happened." I stared at him in disbelief. "Just happened? You're telling me this wasn't planned?" "No, I didn't plan it," he said. "But sometimes, things don't go the way you expect." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I fought to stay calm, but I could feel the rage building inside me. "So you think this is just some mistake? Some accident?" I took a step closer. "You've been with her, behind my back. And now you're acting like it's no big deal. He leaned back in his chair, unbothered. It's not like that. Care about her, John. I've always cared about her. But that doesn't change what happened. I clenched my fists, my whole body shaking. What happened is that you crossed a line. You knew she was my wife. You knew what this would do to me. I'm not here to apologize, he said bluntly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. But I won't lie to you either. I won't pretend it was easy. Felt like a slap in the face. You think I care about your honesty right now? You've destroyed everything. And you're just sitting there, acting like it was no big deal. He stood up then, walking around his desk to face me directly. I'm not going to pretend I don't feel bad about it, he said, his tone softer. But I didn't make her fall in love with me, John. I didn't make her choose me over you. That stung more than I cared to admit. So that's your excuse? You didn't make her? You think that makes it okay? I'm not saying it's okay, he said, his voice firm. But you need to understand it wasn't just me. It was both of us. You need to deal with it because you can't change what happened. The room felt suffocating. I could feel the tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. So what now? I asked through gritted teeth. Marcus gave a small shrug. You'll figure it out. You always do. His words hit me harder than anything else he'd said. This was it. This was the man I had trusted, the man I had worked for, now treating the destruction of my life like it was nothing. I turned without another word and walked out of his office, my mind spinning. The door clicked shut behind me, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, breathless. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal or the fact that Marcus had no remorse. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't sorry at all. His words hit me harder than anything else he'd said. This was it. This was the man I had trusted, the man I had worked for, now treating the destruction of my life like it was nothing. I turned without another word and walked out of his office, my mind spinning. The door clicked shut behind me, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, breathless. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal or the fact that Marcus had no remorse. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't sorry at all. My thoughts tangled and my heart in pieces. But as much as Marcus's cold indifference cut deep, it was Sophie who haunted my every thought. She was the one I had trusted. She was the one I had believed in. I didn't tell her I knew. Couldn't. What was the point? She had already lied to me for so long, pretending like nothing was happening while her world and mine were crumbling apart. The next evening, she came home late, just like usual. She slipped in quietly, the sound of her keys hitting the counter almost too loud in the silence of the house. I didn't turn to face her when I heard her. I just sat there, staring out the window. After a few moments, I heard her footsteps behind me, tentative, as though she was unsure of what to say. John? Her voice was soft, hesitant. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't know what to say. How could I? John, please, we need to talk. Her words pulled me back to reality. I turned around slowly, looking at the woman who had shattered everything we'd built. She looked worn down, exhausted, her eyes red from crying. But I couldn't find any sympathy for her anymore. The damage had already been done. You want to talk? I said, my voice hollow. About what? About how you've been sleeping with Marcus behind my back for months. About how you've been lying to my face while I trusted you. She flinched at the words, her hand trembling as she reached out to me. I never wanted to hurt you, John. I never wanted any of this to happen. It was a mistake. A huge, horrible mistake. I love you. I always have. Please believe that. The words hit me like a slap, but I couldn't allow myself to feel sorry for her. Not anymore. No, I said firmly. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose him. You chose to betray me, Sophie. I can't just forget that. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I couldn't touch her, couldn't let her touch me. Every part of me was screaming to leave, to get away from this pain, from this woman who had torn apart everything I believed in. Please, John, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't leave me.
I'm sorry.
I'll do anything to make it right. I love you. But it was too late. I couldn't hear her anymore. The woman I had married, the woman I had trusted, was gone. And in her place was someone who had betrayed me in a way that was impossible to come back from. I don't know if I can do this anymore, I said quietly, my chest tight with the weight of the words. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. What you did, it's too much. I can't keep pretending everything is fine. Sophie's face crumpled, and she fell to her knees in front of me, her sobs filling the room. But I just stood there, rooted in place, unable to move. How could I be the person who forgave this? I don't know how to fix this, John. I don't know how to fix me, she sobbed, her voice raw with desperation. I closed my eyes, swallowing the lump in my throat. The anger, the hurt. It had consumed me, and now there was nothing left to give. I can't fix it either, Sophie, I said quietly. You've already broken everything, and I don't think I can forgive you for that. I turned away from her, my heart heavy. But the hardest part wasn't walking away from her. It was realizing that the person I had been, the one who trusted, who believed in love, was gone. And there was no going back.